Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green and the Socialist Party's candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist program we ran on. And I think I missed my first week last week. I apologize about that. I got slammed by a cold. My lungs were inflamed and short of breath, and went to the emergency room to make sure I didn't have COVID or pneumonia. It was a cold, but man, this cold set me for a loop. I'm still recovering, but I'll soldier through. Might be a little sloppy when I blow my nose or cough, but that's what happened last week. I was trying to get here, but it's harder to get out of an emergency room than it is jail, I think, because man, they took 2 hours to, and still didn't get me out in time. So anyway, there's a lot in the news, and I think top of the news we got to talk about is this pending war in Iran. We'll put a link to a drop site news source from Jeremy Scahill and Murtaza Hussein, who are really good reporters, and they've been talking to sources in the administration, and these sources are saying 80-90% chance that Trump's going to start a war with Iran in the coming weeks. It could be the coming days. The scale of this military buildup in the Middle East is comparable to before the 2003 Iraq War shock and awe campaign. But the U.S. is going in pretty much by itself, just with Israel. Iraq was, a coalition of the willing. Iraq had authorization from Congress. Trump's just going in. And the reporting is that the U.S. would target nuclear and missile infrastructure and aim to decapitate Iran's political leadership. You say nuclear. Didn't Trump say he obliterated Iran's nuclear infrastructure back in June? Yeah, he did. But lies and contradictions never stopped Trump and his minions. As an aside, would you hire any of these fools for a menial job? I wouldn't. They're incompetent. They constantly lie. They would probably steal equipment and merchandise. They would start fights with the rest of the staff with their racist, sexist, and homophobic slurs. It'd be a damn disaster. I wouldn't hire Trump or anybody he's hired for the most menial of jobs. It's just unbelievable that these guys are, in power in this country. But back to what happens if, the U.S. takes out Iran's political leadership. According to this reporting, the goal would be then to cut a deal like they did in Venezuela. It's regime capture, not regime change. All the talk about, democracy and human rights in Iran and, saying the violence was bad against the protesters. Trump doesn't give a damn about that stuff. He wants an authoritarian vassal state. And this is all about U.S. domination of the Middle East and its oil and gas. Reporting also says the U.S. is prepared for a large-scale military operation, potentially lasting weeks or longer. This is a disaster. It's going to be really a disaster for the Iranian people. The regime there is terrible. It's clerical fascism. People have a right to protest, demand, their rights, but the U.S. military is not going to give them their rights. It's just going to give them misery. If we do attack, Iran's going to respond this time. They've said so. They're going to strike U.S. military vessels, try to strike the land bases around the Middle East. They may close the Hormuz Strait and send oil prices skyrocketing. The Hormuz Strait, 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas passes through that strait. Oil prices are already spiking up because of this. As another aside, that's going to be a gift to Putin because Russia's oil revenues dropped 50% in the last year, which has really been hurting their ability to finance their war machine. And I expect Trump wants that. He's really on Russia's side. He wants to help Russia. Also, higher prices will make domestic shale oil in the U.S., more of it profitable again. So Trump has, oil price reasons to start this war. So the war with Iran is about oil politics, not just the oil and gas in the Middle East, but also in Russia and the U.S. And of course, it's a freaking disaster for the climate. You know, the price comes down, the production goes up, more oil and gas gets burned, and the planet heats. I mean, they couldn't be doing worse to wreck our planet, you know, if they tried to. So what's coming up this week, and I think we all need to step up to this, is there'll be a vote in the House on War Powers Act with respect to Iran. Representatives Ro Khanna and Thomas Massey are going to force a vote in the House. Senators Sanders, Tim Kaine, and Rand Paul are pushing for a vote on the War Powers resolution in the Senate too, but they don't yet have a date for the Senate, and they may have a harder time forcing it. So these votes, you know, are as consequential as the votes leading up to the war in Iraq. So contact your representatives and senators and tell them no war on Iraq. I'm sorry, no war on Iran. So, you know, since we brought up the climate, there needs to be a few words said about that too. James Hansen, you know, the America's most famous climate scientist, has got a paper out, came out in December. We'll put a link to it, predicting that global temperatures are going to rise over 2026 into 2027 by 1.7 degrees Celsius. That's 3.1 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's above the 1880 to 1920 pre-industrial average. That is, you know, a disaster. And it's because greenhouse gas emissions keep rising under, you know, the policies of these petrostates, U.S., Russia, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. And we're entering a new El Nino warming period. So this blows us past the 1.5 degrees Celsius ceiling from the Paris Peace Accord in 2015. And of course, now Trump is trying to accelerate this insanity. His EPA director, I forgot his name. He ran for governor here in New York. He's an idiot. He just repealed the endangerment clause that found that global warming harmed public health and welfare, and therefore greenhouse gases could be regulated under the Clean Air Act. And that has been used to limit emissions from vehicles, factories, and power plants. So now the Trumpies have thrown that out. The repeal is being challenged in the courts, but that's uncertain given the far-right lackeys that have been appointed to the judiciary under Trump and the Republicans. So the surest remedy is to get Congress to pass a law requiring the regulation of greenhouse gas emissions. So there's another demand for Greens to raise in the midterms. And then another insane thing going on is Trump's so-called Board of Peace. And you could spell that B-O-R-E-D, Board of Peace, because Trump doesn't give a damn about peace. He just pledged $10 billion of U.S. money without authorization from Congress to that board. That's 12 times the $767 million that the U.S. pledged to the UN this year, which is down from $4 billion to the UN the previous year. And so this Board of Peace was set up to oversee real estate development in Gaza. They want to turn into a resort area for the profit of Trump and his cronies. And now Trump is talking about this is going to take over from the UN and broker peace all over the world, which means real estate deals. Like in Ukraine, I'll get to that in a minute. He chairs this board in perpetuity, basically till he dies. And what's really pathetic is to see even authoritarian leaders, you know, licking Trump's boots and paying an admission fee of $1 billion to get a piece of this action. And it's just as pathetic to see our mass media not completely ridicule this nonsense and take it semi-seriously. It's just amazing what's going on. So, this board of peace deserves nothing but our ridicule. The good thing is Trump's support is collapsing. The Republicans are headed for a historic defeat in the midterms, the way things are going. And Trump's delusions about the board of peace and all his other stuff is going to come crashing down. Unfortunately, the Democrats are a status quo party of neocon imperialism abroad, neoliberal austerity at home, and climate disaster worldwide. So I've talked about this. There's a political vacuum for independent progressive politics that the Greens should fill. And the polls show that strong majorities of people are ready for a progressive program on economic and social issues. The question for the Greens is, are we ready to give a credible electoral voice for that majority sentiment? And that's our challenge. I keep talking about decadence. Now we got more on the Epstein affair. Prince Andrew just got arrested for misconduct in public office, which means probably sexual assault of Epstein's victims. Meanwhile, here, Trump and his cronies continue to cover up people associated with Epstein and those activities. But Prince Andrew, now he's, in the criminal justice system. He might spill some beans to get reduced punishment. We'll follow that and see what happens. But the Epstein affair is helping to bring Trump down as well. And then let me wrap up today, and this is going to take a few minutes because this is now on Tuesday. It'll be Russia will begin its 5th year of attacking Ukraine full scale. And Thursday, the 26th, will mark the 12th year since Russia began its war on Ukraine in 2014. Back in 2014, on February 26th, this was after the Maidan revolution and Putin's lackey Yanukovych fled Ukraine facing protests. On that day, Russian special forces without insignia, people called them the Little Red Men, started the war against Ukraine by establishing military checkpoints, seizing strategic sites. This is across Crimea, blockading Ukrainian military bases, and the next day seizing the parliament building in Simferopol, Crimea. And by March 16th, only 18 days later, after the Little Green Men had seized the Crimean parliament, Russia had staged a referendum on Crimea to leave Ukraine and join Russia, the Russian Federation. And they claimed a 95.5% vote with a record turnout. Only the naivest of fools can believe that. Just take the Crimean Tartars, who were 12% of the people of Crimea. They weren't going to vote for the Russians who had committed genocide against them and basically removed them all from Crimea back during World War II. And they only came back to Crimea in the early 90s, began coming back. So, that was just staged as bullshit. And it's just pathetic that some people believe it. But I think the thing we need to appreciate today is that Ukraine still stands. And it's time for progressive and peace-minded people to renew our moral, political, and material support for the people of Ukraine and their resistance to Russia's invasion and their rights to self-defense and self-determination. And we got to remember Ukraine, even as we struggle against so many outrages that demand our attention, like the U.S.-backed genocide in Gaza, U.S. military strikes on, looks like Iran soon again, Venezuela, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Nigeria, and small civilian boats in the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean. Trump was the guy that was going to end the endless wars, and he's starting them. And then we got the Trump administration's assault domestically on immigrants' health, the environment, and our social and democratic rights. It's a lot to call our attention, but let's not forget Ukraine, which has been the world's deadliest war over the last 4 years. Since Russia's full-scale invasion began 4 years ago, battlefield casualties, that includes killed, wounded, and missing, have reached an estimated 1.8 million by the end of 2025. And that includes 1.2 million Russians and 600,000 Ukrainians. It's projected to reach 2 million this spring. The battlefield death toll alone is about estimated at 460,000, 325,000 Russians and 140,000 Ukrainians. And then in addition to battlefield casualties among combatants, you've got the civilian casualties in Ukraine, which have reached over 53,000, including nearly 15,000 killed. And the civilian death rate in the last year, while Trump supposedly negotiating a peace, has risen 31% because Russia's escalated its terrorist tactics of targeting civilian homes and energy infrastructure far from the frontline battlefields with missile and drone strikes. And, you know, the horrors of Ukraine join the horrors of other wars ravaging our planet. I did, you know, some estimates, best sources I can find, of death tolls: 150,000 in Sudan, 90,000 Myanmar, 100,000 a recent Lancet report out this week in Palestine, 7,000 in the the Democratic Republic of the Congo. You know, we're talking about at most six figures when we're talking seven figures in order of magnitude more in Ukraine. And, you know, I just think people need to appreciate the scale of destruction and death that Russia's attack on Ukraine has wrought. And of course, people in all these countries struggling for peace and democracy deserve our active solidarity. But, you know, this Ukraine war is just in a class by itself. Russia's been on constant offensives for 4 years. And over the last 2 years, they've been losing about 1,000 soldiers a day. That's 30,000 a month. That's twice as many as Russia lost over 10 years fighting in Afghanistan. Every month, you know, Putin is sending these mostly poor and ethnic minority troops to the slaughterhouse, and he just not stopping. The narrative from Putin and the Kremlin is that Russia's inevitably going to win. But the fact is, Ukraine has fought Russia to a standstill. In the first year of the war in 2022, Ukraine recovered nearly half the land that Russia initially captured, you know, around Kyiv and the northern provinces, a major part of Kharkiv, that's all in the north, and then a major part of Kherson in the south. And then since the beginning of 2023, the front lines have basically been frozen, despite enormous losses in personnel and also material. I didn't even quantify those. Russia has gained only 1.5% of Ukrainian territory over the last 3 years. You know, so much for an inevitable Russian victory. And Russia's rulers are afflicting their people with an endless war, not of their choosing. And look at it this way. Russia has now been attacking Ukraine for longer than it took the Soviet Union to push Hitler's Nazi army all the way back to Berlin. And all they've gained in the last 3 years is 1.5% of Ukraine. And then meanwhile, Russia's war finances are in trouble. Oil and gas revenues, which have accounted for 30 to 50% of Russia's federal state revenues over the last decade, dropped by nearly 50% last year to a 5-year low. And then Ukrainians' kinetic sanctions hitting Russian oil refineries, ports, and tankers have combined with declining oil prices and Western sanctions to really begin to defund Russia's war machine. Russia's military budget is now 40% of its national budget. Talk about militarism. What all that means is that stronger oil and gas sanctions could defund and cripple Russia's military. But as I pointed out earlier, if a war in Iran starts, it might jack up the prices and save Putin's ass for a while. And then the war crimes in Ukraine have been unspeakable. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for President Vladimir Putin and his Commissioner for Children's Rights, Maria Lvova-Belova, for the war crime of abducting tens of thousands of children from Ukraine to Russia for Russified and militarized education. And then further, the ICC has issued further arrest warrants against 4 top Russian military commanders for targeting civilians with their bombs. And then the airstrike terrorism on civilian homes and infrastructure has increased since these warrants were issued a couple years ago. And people have literally frozen to death in unheated apartment buildings with broken pipes pouring water down these buildings and destroying them. In one particularly sad case, a Holocaust survivor in Kyiv, a Yiddish-speaking woman, her neighbors called Baba Zenya, or Grandma Zenya, was found frozen to death in her fourth floor apartment after the pipes broke. They found her covered in ice last month. And that's probably the most poignant case, but it's not the only one. This is just straight up terrorism against civilians. And it gets worse. I mean, Russia in November and again earlier this February has struck electric power substations that feed the cooling systems of nuclear power stations, which cool their reactors and their spent fuel rod pools. And that's risking a deadly Chernobyl-scale meltdown and radiation release. Another unspeakable crime. They call them human safaris. The Russians are training their drone operators in Kherson, a city on the other side of the Dnipro River that Ukraine liberated. That was the last big liberation in 2022. And now they've been bombing that city and now using drone operators to kill civilians. They hit buses, people on bicycles, old women carrying shopping bags. And one study said 1 in 20 people remaining in Kherson City were a casualty of Russian drones last year. They call them human safaris. And the Russians put this on their Telegram channels and brag about it. It's just unbelievable. And then the occupied territories, political repression and forced Russification. If people refuse to take Russian passports, they're denied access to public services, banking, schools, healthcare, anything that the state should provide. And then parents that don't take Russian passports can have their children taken from them for being quote unquote bad parents. They can't prove their ownership of their homes and property, so that's being confiscated. And then, many of these people that don't, completely conform to what the Russians want them to do are subject to what they call filtration, detention, interrogation. Many are forcibly conscripted into the Russian army to, go on these suicidal assaults against their own country, the Ukrainians, subject to torture, sexual violence, and summary execution. So occupation, some of the peace advocates say, well, it's better than war. That's not peace when you're being brutalized like that. And then, another thing we need to really, I think, recognize is that Trump and Putin have an alliance. Just one example, 99% of military aid the U.S. gave to Ukraine last year was cut by the Trump administration this year. And as soon as it came in, it cut all humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Most of that went through USAID. It was for education, healthcare, shelter, heat and power, helping war-displaced persons. HIV drugs, a big issue in Ukraine, is in some African countries. Mental health services for people distressed, children, families, veterans from the war, and other services. And then also immediately upon taking office, Trump administration closed the Justice Department programs to monitor and enforce sanctions against Russia, including on the frozen Russian assets, influence operations in the U.S., oil and gas sanctions, and other sanctions against Russia. They're just not looking at it anymore. The Trump administration also defunded programs to document Russian war crimes. There's an International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine that operates in Europe, and the U.S. withdrew its funding and participation in that. And then the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, which had identified and documented about 35,000 Ukrainian children forcibly abducted to Russia and was trying to locate them. The Trump administration pulled their funding. And then, after the initial invasion, full-scale invasion in 2022, and then again later that fall, and then again in 2024, the U.S. voted in the UN General Assembly for resolutions that affirmed Ukraine's sovereignty and demanded that Russia halt its military operations and withdraw back to Russia. But last year, as soon as Trump got in there in February 2025, the U.S. reversed course. And the U.S. and its satellites, including Israel, voted with Russia against a resolution supporting Ukrainian sovereignty and calling for the withdrawal of Russian troops. That was on the third anniversary of the full-scale war. We'll see if there's a resolution in the UN General Assembly this time, but the U.S. is not going to vote against Russia's invasion like it didn't vote against it a year ago. So why this alliance? Well, I think it's rooted in their far-right ideological affinity for a world where might makes right, imperial spheres of influence, authoritarian rule, and racist, misogynistic, and homophobic, quote-unquote, traditional values. But for the Trump family, it's also about profits. There are grifters on both sides who have been bargaining to partition Ukraine between them like a piece of real estate. The Russian side has been led by Kirill Dmitriev, who's a Stanford and Harvard-trained veteran of McKinsey and Goldman Sachs, who runs Russia's sovereign wealth fund. And like, the Trump side, he's a real estate ripoff artist. He scammed purchasers 15 years ago, this was, in Kyiv of apartments in a building development out of their investments. They didn't get their apartments. He just took the money and ran. So that's the Russian side, and he's the guy trying to induce the Trump people. And on the U.S. side, you got Steve Witkoff, Trump's real estate buddy, Jared Kushner, his real estate son-in-law, and Donald Trump, all of whom have been long engaged in money laundering, real estate investments of Russian oligarchs, and other Russian business ties. And so right now, Dmitriev and Putin are pitching a fantastical, it's a fantasy, a $14 trillion deal to the Trump team, including inducements for Trump family people who would get pieces of this action. And it includes lifting all the sanctions on Russia, joint oil and gas exploration, goodbye climate, returning Russia to the dollar-based payment system, goodbye so-called BRICS, anti-imperialism, preferential U.S. access to the Russian market, compensation for U.S. corporate assets lost in Russia during the war, U.S. aid for Russian aircraft modernization. Yeah, Russia's air technology, they can't even keep their planes up. Joint mining of lithium, copper, nickel, and platinum, and new nuclear power plants to power AI data centers. All things we oppose. And all this is going on behind the backs of the Ukrainians. So what we've had in these negotiations, they call it the dimwit plan, after Russian negotiator Dmitriev and the U.S. negotiator Witkoff, who is really dim if you followed him. And so Russia's demanding that Ukraine cede the occupied land in Crimea, plus land Russia does not control, but partially occupies in Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson provinces. All the news is talking about Donetsk, but Putin has been saying, and Lavrov, the foreign minister, and Peskov, the spokesperson, they're all saying it all go back to Putin's speech in June 2024 when he said, we're not going to stop till we get all those lands. And, Putin's position is if you don't give it to us in negotiations, we're going to take it by force, although they're not doing too well at that. And furthermore, Russia demands that Ukraine have deep cuts in its military, have no international security guarantees, and then have snap elections in hopes of seating a new Ukrainian government that will become a Russian vassal. And now Zelensky has indicated a willingness to compromise, and that would be a freeze on the current front lines and forego joining NATO. But if and only if Ukraine receives credible international security guarantees against further Russian aggression, which the Russians will not accept. And polling shows the Ukrainian public is also reluctantly willing to accept that compromise. But despite Ukraine's openness to compromise and Russia's intransigence, Trump says this nonsensical, stupid shit that Putin wants peace and Zelensky is the obstacle. But of course, we know Trump, doesn't know how to, every time he opens his mouth, he's lying. So Trump's year of negotiations have been the deadliest year for the war for both Ukrainian civilians, but also Russia's predominantly poor and ethnic minority soldiers. Russia's been getting its troops from the rural areas of settler colonized Siberia and so forth, that because they politically are afraid of mobilizing the more affluent people in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So, another thing I need to say about this is we have these campists who say, well, if Russia's fighting the U.S., they're anti-imperialists, so we support Russia. And that's just an anti-imperialism for fools. It says Ukraine is a mere proxy for Russia, for the U.S. in a war on Russia, as if the Ukrainians don't have real reasons to fight for their right to exist. But this Trump-Putin alliance just puts to rest this false proxy war narrative. The campus geopoliticians and the sheltered pacifists on the Western left who spout this nonsense, they're far away from Russian assault troops, missiles, and drones raining down terror on Ukraine. The proxy war claim has always been a canard, but with Trump now aligning the U.S. with Putin, the narrative collapses on its own contradictions. It's more absurd than ever. And we had Artem Chapai, who's a Ukrainian writer, left activist, and now soldier in Ukraine, on our podcast last fall. And he said on another presentation, quote, if this is a proxy war between Russia and the U.S., why are the Ukrainians still fighting after the Trump-Putin alliance? This proxy war nonsense is nonsense. So, our position as, consistent anti-imperialist activists for peace and democracy has to be to continue to support Ukrainian struggle for self-defense, security, and self-determination. And by the way, most Americans do by a strong 2-to-1 margin in recent polling since August, right up until February. It's up to the Ukrainians to decide for themselves democratically what kind of compromises they would accept for a peace deal. In the meantime, we should not stand idly by while Russian and American oligarchs try to partition and sell out Ukraine and divide it between them for their own profits and far-right ideological objectives. So, we need to continue working in solidarity with progressive Ukrainians and Russians to advance their demands. And, those include full and complete withdrawal of Russia from Ukraine, support for the armed and unarmed resistance of Ukrainians against the Russian invasion, international economic sanctions against Russia's war machinery, return of the tens of thousands of Ukrainian children forcibly displaced to Russia and Belarus, freedom for the tens of thousands of Ukrainians, civilians in Russian-occupied territories incarcerated and oppressed for their opposition to the occupation and resistance to a genocidal Russification, freedom for all Russians incarcerated for war resistance and political dissent, like Boris Kagarlitsky, asylum for Ukrainians and Russians and Belarusians, Palestinians, all the people everywhere who are seeking refuge from political repression and war. No amnesty for Russian war criminals, cancellation of Ukraine's foreign debts, confiscation of Russian frozen assets to be used to support Ukraine's self-defense, social services, and post-war reconstruction, reparations from Russia to help fund a full post-war reconstruction. And then on the Western side, end a Western imperialist policy of imposing a neoliberal program of privatization, deregulation, debt dependence, exploitative mineral extraction, and cuts to public services and labor rights on Ukraine today and projected for its post-war reconstruction. We need to ally with the Ukrainian left against those policies. So for them, it's a two-front struggle against Western banks as well as Russian tanks, against both Russian and Western imperialism. And it's a united front struggle for all of us against the far-right international project of Putin, Trump, and their allies around the world. And I'll just conclude by saying it's a damn shame that major organizations on the American progressive and socialist left, and I'm including DSA, the Greens, Progressive Democrats of America, as well as many of the organized peace groups, that they cannot take a consistently anti-imperialist, anti-war position against Russia's war of aggression. So it's the beginning of the fifth year of this war, and I felt it was time to say some extended remarks about it. So I'll stop there and catch my breath and hear what you got to say. Simone Martis. The U.S. ambassador in Warsaw, Thomas Rose, has decided to cut all contact with the president of Poland's lower house after the latter spoke out against awarding the Nobel Peace Prize to Trump, which sparked a big debate and anti-U.S. remarks in the country. So Simone is from Poland, and that's interesting. That's news I hadn't seen. And good for the Polish, U.S. ambassador he cut because the president of Poland, good for the president of Poland's lower house, was saying Trump doesn't deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. It doesn't take a genius to say that, but it maybe takes a little courage given that the U.S. ambassador right away came back at him for quote unquote anti-U.S. remarks. I see them as anti-Trump remarks, trying to get the U.S. back to its senses. So anyway, thanks for that news. It's a crazy world out there today. Shimon Martis. In UK and Norway, a lot of resignations related to Epstein files. A main advisor of the Prime Minister of Slovakia had to leave his post. In Poland, there's a state commission to investigate the Polish, related part of the files, and Russian links to Epstein. And in the US, almost nothing. Yeah, you got it. I mean, people understand this is what we look like to the rest of the world. They're bringing their people to account for their mess with Epstein, and we are covering it up. And it's it's a shame on us. Scout 164. Any thoughts on Nick Fuentes finally deciding that MAGA should be destroyed? Goes to show there's no loyalty inbound. Well, Nick Fuentes is, a stone cold racist. I really don't put much credence in what he's saying. I don't know why he wants MAGA destroyed. But, we got to defeat those people politically and culturally, not take sides between them. For an eco-socialist Green New Deal, I like that name. What's your response to the Supreme Court's tariff decision and Trump's early response? Well, finally the Supreme Court did what the law says. It's up to Congress to, tax and long-term tariffs or taxes. And Trump's early response was 10% on the whole world. And I just read this morning, he upped it to 15% tariffs on the whole world. He's like a spoiled, 4-year-old, didn't get his way and he's having a temper tantrum. I think he's digging himself a hole finally that he's never going to get out of. I just don't see, people that bought into his con, they're finally seeing it. It's about time. Chris Blankenhorn. In Illinois, there's a lot of news about the Chicago Bears building a new stadium over the border in Indiana because they are not getting public funding from Illinois. I know your dad played for the Bears back in the 30s. What are your thoughts on the broader issue of public funding of state stadiums? Well, if the public pays for it, we should own it. And my model is the Green Bay Packers. That's a small town with a Major League NFL franchise because it's been community owned since the 19 teens or 20s. And anybody that lives in Green Bay can buy a share and vote. If you live outside, you can invest in it, but you can't vote. So that town has been able to keep their franchise, and it's one of the best NFL franchises. That's the model, community ownership. And then these billionaires can't blackmail us to keep the team in town, which is what's been going on now for decades. And it's, it's a damn shame. And it's usually doesn't work out good for the town that provides the subsidies. The billionaire makes the money, but the city doesn't. So, the Bears, my dad, I think even my dad, who was kind of conservative, might buy the argument that, Chicago should own the Bears, not some billionaire blackmailing the city. I guess it's the Hallises still own it. They've always owned the Bears. It's hard to imagine George Halas, patriarch of that family, blackmailing Chicago for a stadium. He was a football guy. But now it's a big business, not just a sport. Anthony, there's a growing concern about Africans being trafficked into fighting against Ukraine. Over 1,000 Ukrainians have been sent to fight for Russia. Is there any known resistance in Africa? Yeah, there is. I mean, this has affected a lot of African countries, and I don't have the articles handy, but there's been a lot of reporting on this. It looks like a daughter of Jacob Zuma, who used to be the president of South Africa, was conned into sending even her own relatives over there. They thought they were going to be trained in a security detail, and they got sent to the front line. It's happened to Africans from Kenya, Cameroon, Ghana, and then they also getting African women going there on the promise of education or a good job, and they end up in drone factories doing assembly work. And there's another video out there where a Kenyan has had a mine strapped to him, and he's being pushed out of a dugout to go run against the front line of the Ukrainians as a suicide bomber. There's another video of some Africans singing and dancing in their native language before they're sent to the front lines, and the Russians are saying, these guys don't know it, but they're going to all be killed. It's terrible, and it's there's an historian, and I'm blanking on her name, but she is a specialist in Russian and Ukrainian studies. I think at the University of Pennsylvania, and when she had to do her PhD, she decided not to do field work in Russia and rather do it in Ukraine because the Russians were too damn racist toward African black people. So there's a real problem there, and it's something that has begun to get more attention. I just saw an article on France 24, a 10-minute video report on France 24. So it's getting more attention, and it's it's not that many. The number I've heard is 1,400 Africans have been tricked into going to the front lines. When you consider that Russia loses almost that many every day in soldiers, what it is it's really bad for the Africans, and it's not helping the Russians fight their meat grinder war. So it's something that should be exposed for sure. Vicky Corden, any concern about the midterm elections, even though I have not heard that many Greens are being candidates? That's one of my concerns. I think right now Greens tend to want to run for Congress or Senate or governor without much chance of winning, when we can win local offices and establish a political base for then doing credible challenges for the State House and Congress. So that's one concern. I think we're in a period, post Bernie Sanders, post Donald Trump, where a lot of progressives who in the past would have come into the Greens and run against the neoliberal Democrats are afraid now of the neo-fascist Republicans. So they don't want to be quote unquote spoilers, which means, we need to redouble our efforts to get ranked choice voting and proportional representation, which is a movement that is making gains all the time. And in fact, the right is in a backlash against it, trying to ban ranked choice voting in a number of states. So there's a lot we could be doing. And so I'm concerned that the Greens are not having a high enough profile. And we don't have to have candidates to have an impact on the midterms on the issues. Like I just mentioned, the need to have Congress make the greenhouse gases that can be regulated under the Clean Air Act and repeal this, nonsense that Trump just did. War powers resolutions. We're probably going to get a vote in the House, but not the Senate on Iran. We need to, be pushing that and, hounding the people that are running in those elections, whether it's op-eds or going to candidate forums or doing pickets or doing our own news releases. There's a lot we can do to speak out. Of course, if we have a candidate, it gives us a lot more power in our speech, because then people have to compete for our votes. And if we're saying things people like, and, in our case, it's usually the Democrats are trying to, split the middle and get more voters in the middle instead of doing what's right, we're going to take votes from them. So we have leverage to move the debate. So, yeah, I'm concerned that, this is going to be, for the most part, anybody but the Republicans will be the dynamic, which means a lot of lousy Democrats. Now, I have to say there are some progressive Democrats who are winning these primaries. The problem for the progressive Democrats is they're in coalition with the corporate Democrats. They're the weaker partner in the coalition, and they really haven't been able to get anything done. Go back to the New Deal Democrats coming out of the 1930s and 1970s, when the Democratic leadership turned to neoliberalism. They even called it back then. The progressive Democrats, which at that time was mostly the Congressional Black Caucus, which is now much more corporatized, they had great pieces of legislation for a national health service, for a guaranteed job, for building out, public housing that was not ghettoizing the poor, but, mixing incomes in a really nice way. All kinds of good legislation. They couldn't get any of that moved. So that's the problem when with the progressive Democrats. They go along to get along. I'm thinking of AOC and kind of making peace with Pelosi. One thing, I wrote an article about this in Ralph Nader's Capitol Hill Citizen, which I know got to AOC's office. I don't know if she read it, but She had said at a demonstration supporting the Veterans Administration, Veterans Health Administration, which is a national health service for veterans, publicly owned, doctors on salary of the public, and providing universal coverage, that she wanted a VHA for all, which would be a national health service. So I pointed out in this article, there was a bill that Ron Dellums had in the Congress from 1977 to 1997. It was the most progressive health care legislation. We called the middle of the road position, which is Medicare for all or national health insurance, the great leap sideways, because the income maximizing entities, for profit or just maximizing nonprofit income, would feed at the trough of that public insurance, and you wouldn't control costs. The other thing the Dellums bill had was democratic control. You had locally elected boards elected by the community and the healthcare workers to oversee a community health center in every neighborhood of 25 to 50,000, which would make sure healthcare resources were available to everybody. And then there was another level that I think it was 500,000 to $1 million for a general hospital, and then maybe 5 to 10 million for a research, medical school, hospital, and then the fourth level would be national. And so it was accountable to the grassroots, which means particularly those people underserved would be able to speak up and say, we deserve equal treatment. It was a great bill. So, I don't know if it ever got to AOC, got past her staff, but it's disappointing that, she isn't as visionary as her rhetoric is. We know what she did with the Green New Deal. She watered it down, her and Markey. They eliminated the phase out of nuclear power. They extended the deadline to 100% clean energy from our original goal of 2030 to 2050. They trying to remember all the things they cut, but and in the end, they ended up with kind of a neoliberal program of consumer tax breaks and business tax breaks to incentivize renewables rather than building them through the public sector with a plan, which we need for a rapid transition. So even the most progressive Democrats are not that damn progressive. They're what we used to call in the 60s liberals. They're not socialists. They use the socialist label, but it's really it's a nice label these days, since Bernie said he's a democratic socialist when asked about it. So anyway, I think there's a lot more we could do in the elections, and I hope we will. B.D. Dimmitt, shouldn't we be pairing with libertarians again to push back against the 15% rule for POTUS debates? There are clear and solid points in our favor that I have not heard of from any other Greens. The 30-odd years of being on enough ballots in every single race should make both our parties stand out for staying power, for one. Yeah, that's true. We've gone to court over that 15% rule, and the courts have basically said, well, this is a private entity regulating that, so the courts can't step in. Cynthia McKinney says she's running as a Green for Senate in Georgia. We don't have a Green party that's affiliated in Georgia. Well, we do now, but I think she may be running with the other, which is, transphobic and conspiracy. She's really going off into an anti-Semitic, rabbit hole. I'm not happy about that. She, when my campaign paid for a petition to get the Greens on the ballot in Alaska, and then the organization was so weak that one guy got control of it, and he gave the ballot line to Jesse Ventura, who was anything but a Green, and Cynthia McKinney as his running mate. What kind of politics is that? I don't think that's a good idea. And, it's not cooperating with the Greens. So I don't know what Cynthia's doing. B.D. Dimmitt, can't we sue that entity? Charge them with treason? if they are interfering with the election process. There was another strategy, and that was to get the, I guess to get the major media. There's a campaign on presidential debates. It was trying to get the major media to organize their own debates rather than going through this presidential commission, which is a joint commission owned by the Democrats and Republicans. It's a total setup. And I think that may be a more fruitful path. We've done the litigation and just have gotten nowhere. But if we could get, the media is always looking for, audience and, to set up a debate, including, the major third parties that are on the ballot in many states, would be attractive to a lot of people. So my sense is that, when we get into the next presidential cycle, that would be a more fruitful strategy than, going back to court. We've been beat there. And, the argument is, the courts can't interfere because it's a private institution and they can do what they want. The Commission on Presidential Debates sounds like an official state commission, but it's a private organization. And the damn media is so lackey, in terms of how they relate to the power structure. They treat it like it is a government commission, but it's not. Anthony, North Carolina has 2 military veterans running for U.S. House and 1 for Senate. Whistleblower Anthony Aguilar is running for the North Carolina Greens. He witnessed atrocities in Gaza from Trump's humanitarian mission. Yeah, and he spilled the beans. He's a whistleblower. I'm wishing him good luck and hoping for the best. And he can credibly speak to what an atrocity that, so-called humanitarian mission in Gaza was. He witnessed the contractors shooting Palestinians trying to get food. It's he's got a real story to tell. B.D. Dimmitt, ICE seems to be persuading people that it is coming to the Nashville area. Are you in Nashville? Well, Nashville, trying to remember, they had some resistance to ICE already, haven't they? I think ICE, from some reports I've seen, is going to try to be a little more subtle when it comes in, rather than parading around like a Gestapo, which pisses people off. They're just going to try to do their raids more, without so much flash and bang. But I don't think, given their nature, who they've hired, their track record, it's going to change much. Okay, but I thank you for putting up with my coughing and sniffling, and hopefully, this was a good discussion. Next week, I am planning to go to a Ukrainian, cultural event in Buffalo at a center called Dnipro, where I have, given campaign speeches with Ralph Nader. We set up another one for Jill Stein in 2016. They've been friendly to the Greens, although the Ukrainians are, the diaspora tends to be more conservative. They tended to be Republican, but since Trump came in, not so much now. They're pretty angry with him. So I plan to spend the day up there, and I will get some Ukrainians on the podcast, just regular diaspora Ukrainians, whether they've been here a couple generations. There's that community, and also recent refugees from the war. So that's what we'll be doing next week. And in the meantime, everybody, I keep saying, work in groups, be active. You're going to feel a lot better about things, and it does make a difference. And the immediate assignment now, over the weekend and do it again in a week, is to contact your representatives and senators and tell them you want the War Powers Act resolution against war in Iran. If we could get it passed, it would at least create a constitutional dilemma for Trump if he went ahead anyway. But more likely, we'll be setting a precedent for resisting, this war, which really looks like it's going to happen. So, don't be discouraged. Keep speaking up. It does make a difference. And have a good week, everybody.